And I'm going to be talking specifically about one collaborative effort called the International Brain Lab that I've been part of as a postdoc for the last 2.5 years. I'll talk a little bit more about the lessons we learned in trying to build this collaboration and a few of the strategies that we settled on after a while. So my field is in systems neuroscience, which basically asks the question how neural circuits or brain circuits function and how they relate to behavior. And of course, the brain is an immensely complex organ. And this creates this problem that for a single lab, it's virtually impossible to study all the different parts of the brain, the connections, the cell types, even when we're just trying to understand how organisms produce a single simple behavior. There's another problem, which is that in neuroscience, data sharing has traditionally been very much not the norm. There's even a saying that neuroscientists would rather share their toothbrush than their data. And so collaborating in this age of these big data sets that may have to be collected by multiple labs and combined together is really something quite new for this field. Traditionally, there have been many small-scale collaborations between a couple of professors and their PhD students, but recently there have also been a few initiatives to really scale up. The most famous of this is the Allen Institute in Seattle, which has much more of a centralized corporate organizational structure. They have a huge building, they have tons of staff scientists, and they do these really high-throughput neuroscience experiments in a very standardized way. So this has been really great for the field. They release all these huge, well-curated and beautiful data sets. But that structure is really dependent on their all being in the same building, having tons of stable funding. So it doesn't apply so well to teams of scientists that are in more traditional university labs and want to work together. So the IBL, as I'll call it, the International Brain Lab, is in between those two things. We call it mesoscale, and it's a decentralized collaboration. So what this means is that we're a group of about 22 labs right now, distributed currently in Europe and the US. I think we span quite a few time zones from, I think, Switzerland to the west coast of the US. And each lab is one PI, so there's about 22 professors, and we're a much larger group of about 50 researchers that I'll come back to. So those are postdocs, staff scientists, and students that do most of the hard work. Already in the early days of the foundation of the collaboration, we had a very clearly defined scientific objective, which is to first understand how organisms behave. So to this end, we study mice that make decisions. I'm not going to go into the detail, but you can check out a preprint where we describe in a lot of detail how we study this. So basically, mice have to look at a little screen, they see images, and they have to tell us what they perceive. One of the first things we did in this initial effort is to actually compare all the data coming in from 8 different experimental labs, and to check that we could actually replicate the same results reliably. So here you can see the data where each curve has a different color and comes from one lab. So in our first effort, we spent a lot of time really making sure that we could set up exactly the same experiment in each experimental lab, so that we could then continue and actually merge those data together to analyze it as if it were coming from one source. And we actually tested this, and for those of you that are decoding aficionados, we actually tried to use our data to decode which lab a single animal originated from, and we were unable to do so above chance. So this was the first time that many of us were very excited to see a decoding performance that was not above chance, but it gave us some confidence that really the procedures were standardized enough. And those results are now the foundation for brain recordings that we're doing in the mouse brain, where we're recording the electrical activity of neurons across the brain while animals perform this task, so that we can really study the neural computations that give rise to this behavior. So to achieve this, as I said, we worked on a lot of standardized methods and protocols, and this ranged from very standardized hardware that we all had to build and buy exactly the same pieces, to very detailed protocols for logging a ton of metadata. For example, who is handling the animals each day, at what time do we perform the experiments, a lot of factors about our local institutional situations, like what food do we give the mice, for instance. And this was all very much beyond what's normally reported in a standard neuroscience paper. We also have a great team with several professional software developers that have worked on a big data architecture system. This is also described in a separate preprint, and standardized computational pipelines that make sure that the data is processed in exactly the same way, so that when I do an analysis, it really doesn't matter if I grab my own data or the data from someone in Berkeley or in Lisbon. And we're also trying to closely link experimental neuroscience lab with more theory-focused labs that are focused more on writing code and doing mathematical modeling to understand the data. And what I'll focus on in the rest of the talk is not just these neuroscience-specific topics, but really how we trained the people involved in the collaboration and made this work as a social experiment. So we often joke that the IBL it's just as much a neuroscience experiment as a sociology experiment. So I'll briefly discuss the organizational structure, the infrastructure, the decision process that we have. I'll talk a bit about credit assignments, similar to Trinke, and also about balancing teamwork with individual recognition and career development. So first, the organizational structure. This is from a great paper that is on the Sci archive, actually currently also out in Current Opinion in Neurobiology by Lauren Wool. And what you can see, I'm just going to start here. Can you see my cursor if I move around? Okay, great. Yes. So the core unit of the IBL is the WG, or the working group. So we have working groups that have specific topics. For example, the mouse behavior working group or the computational reproducibility working group. So these can range from, I don't know, 5 to a few dozen people. And they are composed mostly of researchers. Researchers are really the core people in the collaboration. They're postdocs, PhD students, but also technicians and staff scientists. So there's usually a number of researchers in each working group. One of those acts as the associate chair. So that is kind of the elected postdoc very often that takes a more active role in managing the group, for example, scheduling weekly meetings, making sure there's an agenda, and keeping track of what's being done. The working group also has a chair who is one of the principal investigators, or PIs. All the PIs together form the General Assembly. They vote on policy proposals and really form the kind of main decision-making body. And a subset of those is the executive board that meets more regularly and it oversees the day-to-day issues. We also have an executive program manager that is, for example, really important for balancing all the grant, all the budgetary issues, etc. And one of the research is also a representative of all the postdocs in the General Assembly. So this kind of grew over the years. It started with just the General Assembly and the executive board. And actually, as we went along, we discovered that we needed something like associate chairs, because just the chairs by themselves were a bit too far removed from the day-to-day work to be very efficient leaders. So we also introduced further roles as we went. So apart from this organizational structure, what kind of infrastructure do we need? We have a lot of digital tools. So we use Slack for communication, G Suite, which is kind of like Google Drive with a lot of shared documents, complicated permission settings to make sure everyone can access what they need. Of course, we use Zoom. We have all our code on GitHub. And we really try to operate from a principle of transparency, so that we try to not close off too much information. But still, even if you put everything openly and in principle let everyone access it, it doesn't mean that in practice they will access it. So this is from a recent paper where Lauren actually counted that as of earlier this year, there were almost 35,000 Slack messages, 363 Zoom meetings, 187 presentation slide decks, 233 spreadsheets, et cetera, et cetera. So it's actually a really big challenge to make sure that people know what information is there and where to find it and in what cases they need to access it. So here you see another example of all of our Slack communication. Each circle here is one Slack channel that corresponds to a working group. So for example, we have a working group on mouse behavior, on physiology, but also on outreach, for instance, on the data architecture and on publication policies. And the lines between these working groups are people that send messages to both. So if I'm a very central person, I may be involved in 10 of those working groups, then this would be indicated by these lines. And the further away, the fewer the connections are. So here you can see that there's a kind of cluster of more active experimental working groups, like analyzing neural data, recording physiology, and a few that are a little bit more peripheral, like the long-term milestones of collaboration, or how do we govern ourselves. And one thing that is, of course, really crucial in such a big group is to have efficient communication. We found that a mix of digital working together with sometimes personal meetings works quite well. In a way, we were kind of well prepared for the pandemic this summer because we were already doing most of our communication online anyway. But we do find that by meeting once or twice a year with a group and kind of building more personal connections, it really helps very much to lower the threshold for people to interact with one another and keep a bit of humanity, I guess, in the communications. And one thing that we've also found very much is that apart from topic experts, you need just that can point others to the source of information, or even make others aware that a certain policy actually exists, for instance. So we have, for instance, a technical manager who oversees a lot of the technical development. And naturally, people kind of bubble up as being these information hubs. They tend to be the veterans that have been around longest, or the people that just care and are just active Slackers, or like Slack users. Of course, one danger is that this is a bit sensitive to having a few of those core people that carry a lot of the institutional knowledge. So it's a constant back and forth between documenting things explicitly in written form and relying on kind of verbal communication and interpersonal communication. So how do we make decisions as such a big group? So we're using a model that is called Sociocracy. It's a little bit different from democracy. And how it works is as follows. So someone has an idea. For instance, a while ago, I had the idea that we needed an environmental sustainability policy because I was thinking a lot about how much we were traveling as a community, etc. Just as an example. Anyone in the collaboration can then write a proposal. You can have this, you can be assisted by the governance working group or the publications working group, and everyone can then discuss it. So you just share the proposal and you ask for comments over, I don't know, a few weeks' time. Ultimately, after this discussion period, everyone in the General Assembly gets to vote on it. Now, they can say a few things. They can make an objection, which is a well-reasoned argument that the policy would do harm. And this effectively blocks the proposal from going through. But you can, of course, go back and edit it until all these objections have been resolved. The other option is to consent. And here it's important that consent is a much lower threshold than consensus. And it's really saying, I think this is good enough for now and safe enough to try. So let's move on. So we try to keep it relatively simple to implement things to avoid being in this deadlock where everybody has to agree that this is the best course of action forever, in which case you would probably never get anything done. The fourth topic I want to talk about is the same as Trinke, and this is credit assignment, which is, of course, a huge issue that I think affects early career researchers very strongly and is always on everybody's mind. So we're talking about this a lot. And one way of listing credit in publications that I like a lot, this is a proposal actually from Nick Steinmetz, you can check out his tweet if you're interested, is to make these contribution tables. Now, this is a little bit less standard than the traditional statement where you just write on Urai, conceptualize the experiment and collect the data, for instance. Instead, you would have these different categories. In this case, they are these credit categories that Trinke already put up on her slides. which have these different types of contributions, and these are then all the people. Now, this is a relatively small paper that Nick published with a few others. In our case, it quickly looks like this. So over the course of writing this paper about the behavioral standardization that I linked to, we very quickly realized that we would have not only a lot of authors, but also a lot of different tasks. So here you see all the people. I think I'm somewhere here. Please don't try to read this all, it's way too much. But you can just see that the credit categories are things like methodology, but also software, writing, and supervision. So those are a little bit more traditional, but we tried to really specify a subset of those. We also made this matrix continuous. So there's actually 3 levels, where light means support, middle pink, I guess, means equal contribution, and the dark purple indicate really a leadership role. So we try to also differentiate between those to be able to give people credit for really taking a leading role or just taking a more supportive role. I should also say that initially we wrote a version of this paper kind of in a bottom-up way. So many people were in the end writing the paper. It didn't go very well. We sent it for review. It got back some very harsh reviews. And in the end, we decided that we really needed a core group to take charge of the paper writing process and to really not only get credit, but also take a little bit more ownership for going really from the start until the end. So we defined what we now call a task force, which is something like a handful of people that when we bring out one paper really takes the leading role in conceptualizing how we're going to write it, what's the message, and how do we present the data. So we're also still going back and forth a little bit between this very distributed way of producing science and having a little bit more centralized groups, which so far is working out quite well. Lastly, one other continuous topic that we struggle with and that I think definitely for me as a postdoc in the collaboration has been a concern, and also for many others, is how do you trade off the work that you do for the team with your own the type of work that may be more beneficial for your career in the current scientific environment that we live in. Of course, and this may differ a bit between fields, but in neuroscience, first author publications are still very much valued and are really crucial for career progression. So a lot of people are worried, well, if I spend all my time building these nice pipelines for the team, then what do I get out of it? I won't be able to find a job later. So what we have set up is actually a kind of dual system where you work a little bit for the team, but people also have individual projects. So here you can see, for example, the project that I set out to do, which is on investigating the effect of learning on visual processing and decision making. The details are not very important, but what we tried to establish is the idea that it's okay to have your own side project. You can use the shared data set or you can collect some new data, but everyone has to be super open and transparent about what they're doing. So we have this GitHub repository where everybody basically keeps each other informed all the time about the projects that they're pursuing. And this way we try to not only avoid conflict, but also encourage collaborations where I may, for instance, want to work together with someone who has more statistical knowledge or another type of data acquisition expertise in order to have these kind of smaller scale collaborations within the bigger IBL contexts. And so far, this is made sure that we avoid any direct conflicts where people want to work on the same thing and still get credit for it. And one consequence of this model is also that we publish both platform papers with the whole team with these really long author lists, as well as more traditional personal papers where there are a few authors. The first author is the lead author. Their professor is normally the last author, and there is a much condensed author list. But the International Brain Lab would still be one of the authors so that we can link it to the collaborative effort. Okay, I will leave it at that and thank everyone in the IBL. This was us at our last in-person meeting in Paris, which of course this year we weren't able to meet. I want to explicitly thank Lauren Wool, who's a postdoc in London at UCL. She really shaped a lot of my thinking on these topics. And I will also share 3 publications that you can check out if you're interested in it. Lauren wrote a really nice piece about some of these ideas from sociology and how they apply to our collaboration. There's 2 other papers that you can check out that introduce more of the neuroscience behind it. And thank you very much for your attention.